In the last section, we introduced this concept of state inside of our component. State is the concept that we use for updating the data that our components show over time as the user starts to kind of click around, or whenever we start to load some data or any type of update to our application. At this point, we've had a little bit of a discussion about state and written some code around it. In this section, I want to expand more on the idea of state and exactly how our component is now working now that we've introduced state. So let's pull up a diagram. So this is an updated kind of timeline of what's going on inside of our application. And I know the text is small now that I look at this. I'm just going to finagle with some of the sizing real quick. All right, maybe that's a little bit more legible. Okay, so again, this is the timeline. We went over this previously, but I've added in a couple more steps now that are colored in green. So now we can walk through the timeline of our application. So again, our application boots up, app shows to the screen, the app renders itself, header and album list, and now when album list gets created, it gets an initial state of albums being an empty array. So when the thing first boots up, albums is an empty array. The album list says, okay, I'm being rendered, time to call component will mount, blah, 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 makes the HTTP request, and then its render method is called, and it appears on the screen. So the album list is rendering one time when its state is still equal to an empty array. And we were able to confirm that because our console log over here in Chrome, we saw, hey, albums is an empty array. And we had placed that console log inside of our render method. So clearly, the render method is getting called at least one time here before any data has been fetched. So then some time passes, blah, blah, blah. And our HTTP request, there we go, returns some amount of JSON data to our component. And so now here's where the magic happens. We have a request handler that calls setState. And it says, hey component, here's some new state for you. Here's the complete entire list of albums. Because we call setState and we update our component's state, the component just album list, not the app, not the header, just album list instantly gets re-rendered to the screen. So the second time the render method is called, we now have our list of albums. And we were able to confirm that with our console log. Here's the list of the 5 albums. So the point here, the whole kind of point of this is that now we can write our render method in such a way that it assumes that there's some amount of data available as this.state.albums. And that is how we are going to write a component that is going to show a list of data or some amount of data that we fetch asynchronously. So we are using state, the concept of state, to fetch some data to show to our users. So let's do a quick review of state, and then we will update our component to actually, show some good stuff on the screen. So one last thing, I want to go over some rules of state. So first off, I've kind of skirted around what the real definition is for state. I've just been saying state, state, state. I can say it all day, I guess, but it doesn't really make any sense until I give you a plain text definition. So here we go. Definition of state: a plain JavaScript object that is available to class-based components only, that is used to record and respond to user-triggered events. And so that last part here, user-triggered events, I use kind of lightly, kind of freely. And if you think about it, a component loading up kind of is a, kind of a user-triggered event. It's something that the user triggered. They launched the app on their device. Yeah, they triggered it. And we now know that the user just requested some amount of data, and we now need to show it to them. So think about state whenever you want to update your component in some fashion because of a user-triggered event. Now the second rule that I want you to be aware of for right now is that whenever we need to update what a component shows, whenever we want to re-render in some fashion, we are going to call setState. That is what we use setState for. When we call setState, the component instantly re-renders. So whenever we want to update what it shows, you gotta be thinking state. And I'm going to just again and again and again, I'm going to be, throughout the rest of this course, I'm going to be saying, okay, we need to update the component. We need to show something new. What should we be using here? And then you at home, ideally, you're going to say, oh, Steve, yeah, hey, we should be using state. And then, we're going to use state and we're all going to be really happy. Okay, so I'm just going to keep doing that throughout the course. Next, last rule I want to talk about, we only change our state, we only make updates to it with the method setState. We do not do this dot state, and I guess I kind of dropped my thought there. Oh, no, it's on there. It's just not showing up. We do not do something like this dot state equals 1, 2, 3. Okay, we never modify a property directly. We always call setState whenever we want to update our component state. Okay, the last thing to say here that I did not actually put on this slide is the difference between state and props. This is something that people really get messed up or kind of confused over time. The difference between the prop system and the state system. So I'm going to give you a lot of guidance as we go through the course about which one we want to use. But let me just say right now, just give you a general rule of thumb. Whenever we want to communicate from a parent component to a child component, we use props. Okay, so props is for parent to child communication. State, on the other hand, is for a component's internal record keeping. That is the purpose of state. We use state whenever we want to update some amount of data over time. Whenever we pass data from a parent to a child, then it is props. That is the difference between the two. And again, I will point out just a ton when we should be using one or the other. All right, so that is just a ton of lecturing. Ton of lecturing about state. I think that we're in a pretty good spot now with state and fetching data, all that kind of good stuff. So let's continue in the next section, and we are going to work on making some nice looking albums to show the user, nice looking album components to show the user. So let's continue in the next section by making use of this new albums data that we've now fetched. In the last section, we finished up our discussion on state. Just the one last thing I want to mention about it is that we only use state with class-based components. So I've got a class-based component right here. This has access to state. Any functional components we create, like the header, does not have access to state. So whenever you want to use state, you got to be thinking class-based component. Good. Last thing I'm going to mention there about state. So at this point in time, believe it or not, we have probably covered about 85% of the entire React API, like all the different methods you can call. We've talked about props, state, lifecycle methods, functional components, class-based components. There's not a lot more to talk about regarding React. So React really has a famously tiny library, and it's certainly a subject that I would say is quick to learn but long to master. So as far as the React side of things go in this course, we are really going to build out our knowledge of all the topics we've covered so far and figure out how to combine them in more complex ways. But there's not really many more topics like really brand new API calls or systems or anything like that having to do with React that we're going to be discussing. So it's one of my favorite part of the libraries without a doubt. Anyways, we now have our list of albums. They are available as this.state.albums. That is what they is set to. That's how we're going to get access to that list. So it is now time for us to build a list of albums to show the user. We want to show a list of components. In particular, because we loaded up 5 different albums, we should now have 5 different album detail components. Remember, we said that the album detail component was going to be the component that would show just a single album. So in other words, what we need to do now is make a list. That's what we got to do. Let's pull up a diagram really quick that's going to help us understand how to build lists. So on the left-hand side is a representation of the albums array that we have. So this.state.albums. So each red box here represents one album. What we need to do is kind of transform each of these objects into a component. That's our goal. For each album that we have loaded up, we want to create one album detail component, which we're going to create very shortly here. That is the goal. To do this transformation, we're going to use the map method. We are going to map over our array of albums, and for each album we have loaded, we will return one album detail component. Okay, so that's the goal. Back over inside of my album list, I'm going to make a helper method to generate this list of album details, excuse me. So I'm going to add a method in here called render albums. Then I'm going to take my list of albums that we've now fetched, which is available as this.state.albums, and I'm going to map over it. If you're not familiar with the map function, no problem. Map is an array helper. I get to call it on this.state.albums because albums right here is an array. The way that map works is we pass in a fat arrow function. Then inside of the fat arrow function, or excuse me, let me rephrase that. Our fat arrow function will be called 5 times, one for each album that we've loaded. Whatever we return from that function will be entered into a new array that gets returned from the map function. I don't know. I can talk about this stuff for all day. Let's just put the code in, and I think it'll be a little bit more obvious what's going on. So I'll add in my fat arrow function. The fat arrow function will be called with a single album out of the albums array. And then for each album, I'm just going to return a text tag that contains the album's title. So album.title. Notice that because I am inside of some JSX here, and I want to make reference to a JavaScript variable, specifically album.title, I'm going to wrap it with curly braces. So remember, whenever we want to reference a JavaScript variable within JSX, we wrap it with curly braces. Otherwise, React just thinks we're trying to show some text. And finally, I'm going to make sure that I return this new array that I've now created. Let me get some more space here. There we go. Then the last step is I'm going to replace, inside of my render method, I'm going to replace that text tag down here with a reference to this.renderAlbums. So again, I am making reference to a JavaScript variable or function within some JSX. So I'm going to replace, or I'm going to place my curly braces and then call this.renderAlbums. All right, so let's give this a shot now. I am going to flip over to Simulator. Let's do our refresh. And hot dog, I've got a list of all my album names. Taylor Swift. I'm not, necessarily a Taylor Swift fan. I'm not going to say I'm a Taylor Swift fan, but she's a nice neutral middle ground. I consider doing a lot of different albums for this app, but Taylor Swift works. That's all I'm going to say on Taylor Swift. So here's we definitely are rendering the name of each album. We've got all 5 albums here, but we also have a warning that just popped up on the screen at the bottom. Something about each child should have a unique key prop. Check the render method, something, something, something. So let's take a quick break, continue the next section, and figure out exactly what this warning message is about. We've now got our list of albums rendered on the screen, all the albums we got back from the JSON endpoint, but we did get a little bit of a warning message down here, something about a key property. So this is a little bit of a gotcha with React. Whenever we show components that are in an array, and that is exactly what we're doing here with the renderAlbums method, we are producing an array and rendering it inside of our JSX here. Each component inside of that array must have a key property associated with it. The whole purpose of this is just for performance concerns. It's how React makes sure that as it re-renders a list of components, it is intelligently re-rendering or updating a very particular component. So to fix it, I'm going to place my JSX on a new line just to give myself a little bit of space. And then inside of the text tag, I'm going to add on a key property. And the key property here is what React is going to use to figure out which item in the list it is updating at any given time. So the only requirement of this key property is that it must be unique against all the other elements in the array. And number 2, we also must make sure that it is the same value across re-renders of the list. So a common mistake to make is to say, oh, well, I'll just use the index of this album within the array. That is not something that's guaranteed to be consistent across re-renders, and so it's not really appropriate for use as a key. In this case, we're working with a list of albums. Each title is actually kind of sufficiently randomized, or unique, so I will use a key of the album's title. On actual applications, by far the best property used for a key is if your resource has an ID associated with it. So you can just use a key of the record's ID right here. In this case, our albums do not have an ID, so we don't get the benefit of that. All right, let's refresh. And it looks like the error went away, so everything is fantastic now. So back to what we were working on. Right now we have the name property, or excuse me, title property of each album displayed, but that, not too useful, not at all. We want to see a lot more detail related to each album. So as I mentioned previously, we will create a new component called album detail. An album detail is going to take one album as a prop or property, and it's going to render a lot of information about that single album. So in this section, we're going to start working on this new album detail component. Remember the process we go through. Anytime we make a new component, we make a new file. So in my components directory, I will make a new file, and I'm going to call it albumdetail.js. And then inside of here, we will put down our boilerplate. So I will import React from React, and I will import both view and text from React Native. Now this is something where I'm going to start asking you ahead of time whenever we start creating a component whether or not this needs to be a class-based component or a functional component. In this case, for the album detail, we have something that is just showing some data to the user. It is solely a presentational component. And so I think that this can stand to be just a functional component because we do not need lifecycle methods and we do not need to get access to state. So I will define my functional component, and then I will export it as by default. Cool. So now the last thing I want to do before we go too far here, I want to go back to my album list and just import it over there so we've got it nice and ready to make use of. So back inside of album list, I will import the album detail, and now we need to consider what the root, or excuse me, what the relative path to that file is. Well, it's in the same directory this time. Album list is in the same directory as album detail. So I will say in the current directory, // give me album detail. Cool. Finally, inside of render albums right here, I don't really want to be showing any text anymore. I want to show an album detail. So I'm going to replace the text tag with album detail, like so. Okay, so this is looking good, but now let's consider kind of like the next challenge here. I'm showing many album details. I want to show one album detail per album. That means that I need to somehow communicate from this parent component, album list, down into the child component, the album detail. Hey, I want you to show this very particular album. Okay, like we need to do some communication there. So if you recall, to do communication from a parent to a child, we make use of the props system in React. So I want to pass the album down to album detail as a prop. So no longer do I want to try to show any album.title here because this is no longer a text tag. So I'm going to take that out. Now that I am not passing in any text in here or anything like that, I should be making this a self-closing component. So I'm going to remove the closing tag over here, and I'm going to make this into a self-closing component by adding in a / right before the closing bracket. Finally, I need to pass down this album as a prop to album detail. Okay, I need to pass it down as a prop. So whenever I want to pass a prop, I'll write out the name of the prop equals, and then inside of braces, I will list the variable that I want to pass down to the child. So album is album. Now inside of the album detail, I will have a prop of props.album, and that will be equal to my album. One thing I want to point out in great detail here, I'm going to point out several times, is that the name of the props, very much like the name of the state that we were working with earlier, is completely arbitrary. I do not have to call this thing right here, I do not have to call this album just because the variable is also called album. There is absolutely no tie between the property name and the variable. So this, instead of album, I could call it like record. And now inside of album detail, I would refer to props.record. Or it can be it could be like data. I don't know, anything we want. So just to make sure that it's really clear, the name of the variable up here does not have to match the name of the prop. It just ever so happens that with a lot of the code that I write, they generally end up as being the same. Cool, so this is looking pretty darn good. I think that in this component, album list, we are no longer making use of the text tag anymore up top. So I'm going to remove that text tag just to keep our imports nice and clean, make sure we're not importing anything that we don't need. Then just to make sure that everything works a-okay, I'm going to flip back over to the album detail and let's consume that prop that we just added. Okay, let's make sure that we're actually making use of that album. So inside of my album detail component, I'm going to return some amount of JSX. I'm going to suggest we return a view tag, and inside of that I'll show some text. So I want to show, again, just to keep the implementation we had before without the album detail equal to what it is now with the album detail. I want to show just the name or the title of the album. So I need to receive the prop that we passed down from album list inside of album detail. So I'm going to receive my props object. On that props object, I will have access to props.album.title. And remember, it is specifically album that I'm making reference to here because inside of album list, when I rendered the album detail, I said, hey, pass down this thing as a prop called album. All right. So this is looking pretty good. The only warning we have here, again, is because I've returning some amount of JSX, or all I'm doing out of this fat arrow function is returning something. So it's saying, hey, if you're just returning something, don't use the curly braces with the return keyword. Again, purely stylistic. We are going to add in some other code inside of here in a future section. So for right now, I'm just going to kind of leave it as it is. Let's refresh our simulator and make sure everything is still working. So I'll refresh the simulator. And yep, we still got our list of albums appearing on the screen. So this looks perfect. We have now refactored our text tag inside of the album list to instead use this album detail component. Let's continue the next section and focus on making this album detail look a lot better than how it already looks. In the last section, we created our album detail component. And the purpose of this thing is to show a nice looking summary of a single album. Something like, I don't know, that right there, exactly. So the album name, the artist name, some artwork cover image thing, and then the buy now button at the bottom. So this is the intent. This is what we're going towards. So before we get started on this, I want to kind of come up with a game plan on exactly how we're going to design and build this component right here. There's two different and distinct methodologies that we can take for building this. First, we might make a single kind of mega component, something that's going to, in one component, render this entire card right here. So we might end up with some JSX that looks like this right here on the right-hand side. We'll have this kind of top-level view for the overall card, like the border that really goes along the outside. And then we'll have 3 blocks inside of that, one for each section inside the card. And the purpose of this view and right here that's going to contain the image and 2 text things, the purpose of this view right here will to have some nice styling to make sure there's kind of margin between the text and some nice border here at the bottom between the image and the header. And this view, same thing, will have a nice border and blah blah blah, nice border on there. So we'll have one single mega component that has all these different things to it, and most importantly has all the styling associated with the overall card inside of this single component. Okay, so that is approach number 1. That is one direction we can go. Now, an alternative layout that we can take, something that's just a little bit different, and I know this looks nearly identical, but there is a very subtle difference. One different approach we can take is to make 2 reusable components that we will use inside of the album detail. So the 2 reusable components that we'll make are the card component and the card item component, or card section. That might be a reasonable name as well. The purpose of the card and card section components will be to just have some amount of, or just a component that will have some amount of built-in styling. So we will have styling that has the nice border that goes along the outside. It will have some nice margin to fit the content inside of it. And basically, you get the idea. It's going to have some nice styling that we are not going to locate inside of the album detail component that we've already created. Now, why might we do this? Why might we take this approach? Well, pretty much for what I just said. We'll have separate files, the card and the card item, that will just know how to show some amount of content inside of it, but most importantly, it will be a reusable component that will have really nice styling associated with it. So if we were writing if we were writing vanilla HTML and CSS here, this might be just like a very fancy div or something like that. That we can swap out different detail in the future, like different image, different button, and still have a nice like card thing that looks really good. So I think that is the direction that we want to go. I want to make a card component and a card item, or we might call it card section, that will both be reusable, and all they're going to do, there's not going to be any fancy logic inside them, anything like that. The only purpose of the card and the card item is to have some nice styling associated with putting this card together here. So if this sounds a little bit strange, like, Stephen, why are we making these extra components? What is the point of this? Trust me, once we start putting the styling together, once you see the amount of styling it takes to get something that looks good, you're going to say, okay, yep, the good idea. Like, making this reusable is a fantastic idea, so we don't have to rewrite all these styling rules again in the future. That is the whole idea here. I want to just save out on the amount of styling we have to write. So let's get started on these in this section. Let's start building this card component and this card item. And I really don't like the name card item. I think we might rename it to card section. We'll see what happens. Anyways, let's get started by making the card component. So again, a new component means a new file. Inside of my components directory, I'll make a new file called simply card.js. And then inside of here, we'll put together our usual boilerplate. I will import React from React. I don't want to import React Native, I just want a Vue. So I'll import Vue from React Native. And let's do const card. And for right now, we'll just return a Vue tag. And I'm going to leave it open, so we will get a ESLint error here about it needing to be self-closing, but that's okay. We're going to fill something in here in just a while. And at the bottom, we'll do our export default card. Cool. Okay, so again, just to be clear, the sole purpose of this component right here is just to make something with some nice styling that looks like a card. So that's what we're going to be focusing on. Let's continue with this in the next section. In the last section, we put together a new component for showing a card. The card's purpose is just to look nice and wrap some other existing component as well. So it's going to be enhancing our view or enhancing the style of our application in some fashion. With React.js applications, if you have any background with that, it's kind of rare to make a component that just adds some amount of styling. But in React Native, because we want to have some reuse of style throughout our code base, and we don't have the benefit of separate CSS files, it's a little bit more common to make standalone components whose sole purpose is to add some styling into the application. Okay, so let's add in some styling here. There we go. Remember our goal for adding styling, or the approach that we use. Underneath the component, we add a new object called styles. That will be an object, and then we'll give it a single property. And in this case, I'm going to call it container style. Now I'm going to call this specifically container style because it's going to be some styling that we're adding to this view tag right here. And the whole purpose of this view tag is to just wrap some other component. And so you can kind of think of it as being like a container. And so that's where I'm coming from with this word container style right here. One thing I want to throw out there, the names of all the style properties that we use throughout the course, completely arbitrary. I'm just kind of picking them. Not necessarily at random, I'm putting some thought into it, but you can change it from container style to anything else you might want to have. So totally up to you. Now I want to apologize right now because we're going to add a lot of styles to this container style right here, a lot of typing. So let's just get to it. We'll just power through all the styling. Once we're done with it, I think we'll both be really happy to be done. So let's get started. First off, we're going to give this card a border. So we'll assign a border width of 1. This says put a border around the component and give it a pixel width of 1. So a nice thin border around the outside. Next, we'll give it a border radius of 2. A border radius says at any corners of my component, round them off nicely. So give it just kind of rounded edges, rounded corners, excuse me. Next, a border color of DDD. So this border color right here is going to give us a nice light gray border along the outside. And finally, for the border, we'll give it a border bottom width of 0. So we assigned a border width of 1 up above, but for the bottom of the border, the bottom segment, we're saying don't give it any width, just hide the border entirely. So the reason for this is related to the card section or card item component that we're going to work on later. So there is a reason that we're kind of zeroing out the border there. We'll discuss it once we get to the card item. So that's it for borders. Next, we'll give this thing a shadow. The purpose of the shadow is just to give this thing a little bit of pop or a little bit of elevation appearance to it, right? It just makes it feel like the card is something you could kind of pick up and drag off the screen. So we'll start off with a shadow color of 0, 0, 0, a shadow offset with a width of 0 and a height of 2. Remember that the shadow offset specifies what side we want the shadow to be on. So I don't want any shadow on the left and right side, but I do want a height to the shadow, so it's going to appear to have some shadowing to the bottom. Next, we'll give a shadow opacity of 0.1. If you recall, the shadow opacity is what is used to kind of give darkness or kind of light. Opacity is really about making a component or an item see-through, so to speak. By applying opacity to a very dark color, it kind of lightens it up a little bit. We can go anywhere from 0 to 1 with the opacity. Giving a 0.1 gives it just kind of very nice light gray color to it. Next, for the shadow radius, we'll give a 2, so 2 pixels for the radius. A shadow radius right here is just like the border radius. So at the corners of the shadow, it'll round them off nicely. And this is really important because it's going to map up nicely with the border radius as well. If we had a border radius of 2, but then the shadow was like, had square edges or square corners, it would just look really goofy. And so that's why we're assigning a shadow radius here as well. Next is the elevation. We'll talk about why we have elevation later on. And then we'll give some margin. So a margin left of 5, a margin right of 5, and a margin top, of 10. These margin settings right here behave the exact same way as they do with normal CSS. They're used to just place some spacing in between components. So a margin left and a margin right says, hey, give me some spacing against the left and right hand sides of the device, the actual screen. And then the margin top is related to when we show a card in a list. So if we have some list of cards, we want to make sure that there's some reasonable spacing in between each one so they don't just kind of all stack right on top of each other. And so that's why we give it a margin top of 10. Cool, so last step now, we're going to apply this container style to our view tag. So on the view tag, I will say style. Make sure you do not say styles. It's not plural, it's singular here. And then into there, we'll pass styles.container style. And I'll new line the view tag as well. Of course, we still have the ESLint error here. It says components should be closing if they don't have any contents. We actually are going to add some contents in here very shortly in the next section. So let's take a quick break and talk about exactly how we are going to use a card component, like this one right here, to wrap some other component. So let's take a quick break and take care of that in the next section. In the last section, we added some styling to our card component, so I think it's probably all ready to go from the visual side. But now we need to be able to use it in somehow, right? We got to be able to use the card component we just made. So really quick, I want to pop open a diagram that we were looking at a little bit ago. In the JSX on the right-hand side, we had said that the card was going to be kind of like the overall rectangle for this thing. And in the JSX, you may have noticed that I put some other components within the card tag. Now we've already seen instances where we passed one component to another within inside of some tag, but that was always when we used it with a view tag. So if I go back to my top level app component, you'll see that I placed the view tag and I gave the view tag the header and the album list. But right now we only know how to pass kind of data down into a component as a distinct prop. So we need to figure out some other different fashion to pass components around. so that one component can render another, much in the same way that the view tag renders the header and the album list. So it's kind of hard to give you a really nice lead-in into exactly how this works, so we're going to kind of just dive right in, and I'm going to show you exactly how to do this. First, I'm going to find the component that I want to wrap with the card component, and so that's going to be our album detail. So inside the album detail, I'm going to import card from card. Now here's how it's going to work. I'm just going to replace the existing view tags that I have in here with the card component. So now I've got card, and it's being passed the text. I'm not using the view tag anymore from React Native, and so I'll remove that import off the top. Okay, so this looks like what we want, right? We've got our component card, and we are passing it the text tag. But we need to now manually tell the card component, hey, if you get past any components, if you get past a text or a card section or another view or whatever it might be, you need to be responsible for rendering this at some point in time. So we have to instruct card on how to render any children that it gets passed directly. So here's how we do that. I'm going to flip back over to our card component. Here we go. And then we'll add in our reference to props as the argument. Now here's the magic. Anytime that we pass a component that we write another component, that component will show up on the props object as props.children. So if we just add a reference inside of our JSX to props.children, it will render any components that we pass to this card one. So now we can kind of imagine that by adding what we just added, the reference to props.children, we kind of took this text tag right here that we're passing to card inside of album detail, and we're kind of just saying, you know what, just take that whole thing and just stick it right in here. Just stick it in between the two view tags. That's exactly what's going on by just adding this reference to props.children. Okay, so I think that we're now in a good spot to give this a good test inside the simulator. Let's pop open the simulator. We'll do our refresh. We're going to do a little bit of a reload. And there we go. All right. So we've got what looks like, all right, it's not super pretty just yet, but we definitely have the card component in there. We've got a nice outline on the top and a shadow on the bottom, and it appears that there is some margin on the left and right hand side. So you see that's the 5 pixels that we add on either side. And then in between each card is the 10 of spacing. So the cards do not exactly butt up against each other. There's some kind of space there. You'll also notice we reclaimed the space at the top for the shadow on the header. That was actually getting obstructed before with what we had previously. Okay, so this is looking pretty good. Our card component is now in use. Let's continue in the next section. In the last section, we used a little bit of a trick to make the card component into something really reusable. First, inside of our album detail component, so here's our album detail, we passed the text tag as a component to the card component that we wrote. So we passed it inside of the card tag. Next, inside of the card component, we took our props object and then we added a reference to props.children inside of our JSX. Because we added props.children, our component that we added inside of album detail automatically showed what we passed to the card detail component. So I don't use the word component, I'm just throwing it around like candy over here, but I hope you get the idea. Basically, if we pass one component to another, it will show up in the parent as props.children. So we just have to provide a reference to props.children somewhere, and boom, we're good to go. Also, a little bit more importantly, we definitely got our card component up on the screen, so that is fantastic. We're going to move ahead now on to our next component, which will be the card item component. So the whole job of this thing is to make sure that we have some distinct sections within the card that make it, just look a little bit better than what we've got right now. Certainly if we have just text inside of this card item, I would at least expect it to be better formatted than what we've got right here. So that's the purpose of the card item. Again, I had mentioned a couple sections ago that we might rename this thing to card section. I don't know what it is, but I just feel like I'd be a little bit happier if I called this thing card section. There's absolutely no reason to go one way or the other. This is solely personal preference. So let's create this new card section component. inside of our components directory, I'll make a new file called cardSection.js. And then inside of here, we will throw in our boilerplate. So we'll import React from React. We'll import our view tag from React Native. And then we need to create our component. And again, we have to ask ourselves, as is our standard strategy right now, should this be a class-based or a functional component? So just like the card, this is solely something that is going to show some, basically a presentational component. It's just showing some information to the user. It doesn't need to have any lifecycle events or any data fetching, anything like that. It doesn't need access to state. So I think we're good to go with making this a functional component. So we'll make our card section component. By default, it will return a view tag. And at the bottom, we'll add our export statement. So there's our export statement at the bottom. Cool. So again, this is just like our card component. It is primarily going to be used for some styling. So again, we'll start off with adding some styling. We'll say const container style, const style. So here's our style object. And we'll add a container style to it. And again, inside of here, we'll pass in some styling. Definitely fewer rules this time around, so not quite as much typing, but definitely still a few. First off, we'll put on our border bottom width of 1. So if you recall, back inside of our card component, we specifically said, I want a border bottom width of 0. We turn the thing off. And the reason for that was that our card component is going to have a lot of these card sections. So if we had a card section inside of here, and we had both a border bottom on the card section and the card, we would be doubling up on the borders on the bottom. But still, we do have to have a border bottom on every card section to handle the case in which we've got maybe a single card section up here. This thing definitely still needs to have a border on the bottom of it. So this whole border bottom thing is just to reconcile the issue between either a card or a card section having the border on the bottom. Next, we'll give it a padding of 5. This is just going to provide a little bit of spacing between whatever's inside the card section and the border around it. Next, a background color, and we're just going to be very specific about the color that we want, so FFF. And then we will add in some justify content rules, or I should say flexbox rules. So I don't want to talk too much exactly about the purpose of these particular 2 flexbox rules that we're using right now. We are going to come back a little bit later and talk about exactly why we are specifically specifying flex start and also a flex direction of row. So again, we will come back and discuss why we are adding on this flex direction property here. Then we'll do a border color of DDD. And then I'm also going to give it a position of relative. And again, I'm sorry, one more property where we're just going to have to throw it on here, and we're going to come back and talk why we're adding on relative later on. Okay, so that's it for our styling this time around. Again, I encourage you to maybe pause the video really quick and just double check your spelling on all these property names. After that, we will add that style object to our view tag. So we'll say style should come from styles.container_style. And you'll notice ESLint has very helpfully let me know that I made a little bit of a typo. I really want this object at the bottom to be styles, not just style. So I'll rename it to styles and we should be good to go. Cool. All right, so just like the last component we made, just like the card component, we also want this card section to contain some child components that we decide what they are on the fly, right? For the header, I want it to be an image and some text. Inside of the center section, I want to have an image. And at the bottom, I want to pass it a button of sorts. So again, we need to use that props.children reference inside of this component. So the cards.section component will add on a reference to the props argument. And then inside of the view tag, we will place props.children. Awesome. Okay, so let's give this thing a shot. To make use of the card section, we will go over to album detail. So the thought process here is that inside of album detail, we've got our card element, and we're going to give it a couple of different card sections as well. So we can add in immediately a card section to house the text that we've got right here. So we will import card section from card section, and then we will wrap our existing text tag with the card section component. So card section is going to wrap our text tag, like so. And I think that we're definitely at a good place to give a little test for our simulator. So let's flip over to simulator. I'll refresh it. And all right, this is definitely a little bit of an improvement here. We have some definite padding around each element. And you can see that now we've got a little bit more distinct bottom border on this section as well. If we wanted to, just for fun, I might copy and paste this card section to duplicate it. So I'll just duplicate this thing, and let's see how it looks when we have multiple card sections. All right, so now you see the purpose of the card section. The purpose of the card section is just to make sure that we've got a nice little compact area within the card where we can add some content and be happy about it. So this is definitely starting to look good. We do not want to have the doubled up card section, of course, so I'm just going to delete that. But definitely our app is it's really starting to come together on the styling side. So let's continue in the next section and add a little bit more detail inside of our album detail component.